So, light. Light is a form of electromagnetic energy also called electromagnetic radiation. Electromagnetic radiation does some bonkers, weird, and amazing things. Dr. Einstein figured a lot of this stuff out. But that is for physics class and not our story. Light behaves like a particle and also acts like a wave. Light travels in rhythmic waves as massless particles called photons. The waves are uniform, consistent for any given photon. As the photon oscillates, the distance between the crests of the wave can be measured and yield the wavelength, represented by this Greek letter lambda. As you can see in the image at the bottom here, increasing wavelength means the distance between the peaks gets longer and longer. Light, or rather visible light, is just a tiny, tiny part of a much, much larger range of the full electromagnetic spectrum. This image, just like the image of the atom back in chapter 2, exaggerates certain features that just can't be fit into a single slide. The entire range of wavelengths for visible light is only about 370 nanometers, a little over a third of a micron. But the full range of wavelengths of electromagnetic radiation goes from 10,000 meters, or roughly the distance from Auburn's campus to Opelika, down to 10 to the negative fifth nanometers, which is 10 to the negative 14th meters, which is only about 10 times the radius of a proton. A net with a mesh of 370 nanometers, the range of visible light, could strain out just about every type of cell down to about the very smallest bacteria. The shortest wavelengths have the highest energy, and the longest the lowest. In other words, energy and wavelength are inversely correlated. The shorter wavelength, higher energy photons have at the extreme gamma rays, made famous by the Incredible Hulk, though in real life, gamma rays would just shred your DNA to bits, not turn you green and ripped. Gamma rays are produced by some very large stars collapsing at the ends of their lives. X-rays are familiar to anyone who gets regular dentist visits or has irregular misadventures with broken bones. UV is ultraviolet or ultraviolet light. We cannot see ultraviolet light directly, though we can see objects fluoresce under its influence. And prolonged exposure leads to things like sunburn and worse, and can be blinding. Just about all of the EM radiation that is higher energy than visible light is called ionizing radiation because it can damage molecules like those in our bodies, namely DNA. This leads to a whole suite of terrible things, such as cancer and birth defects. I will come back to visible light in a moment. But first, just beyond the perception of our eyes at the longer wavelength end of the spectrum is infrared light that can be perceived through special cameras. The resulting images yield heat maps showing where the relative temperatures are higher or lower. You can see, for example, that the cat's nose is cold and the cat's eyes are warm. Microwave radiation is what we use to cook our food. Microwaves work by jiggling the water molecules in our food, and the friction of that jiggling is what produces the heat. Longer wavelengths of EM radiation are non-ionizing, which means that microwaving food is safe in that it doesn't damage DNA. Of course, you shouldn't try to crawl into a microwave and warm yourself up. That would be decidedly unsafe. The longest, least energetic EM waves are radio waves. Radio waves can carry messages that can be picked up by receivers in cars and homes. Shortwave, FM, and AM radio signals are all examples of signals that can use these waves. Returning to visible light, it is just a minute part of that much broader spectrum of electromagnetic energy. It is the part that our eyes can see and that plants can use for photosynthesis. The order of the colors within the visible spectrum can be remembered with the mnemonic Roy G. Biv for red, orange, yellow, green, blue, indigo, and violet. Red light is the lower energy, longest wavelength, on up to violet, which has the shortest wavelength and highest energy per photon. Our eyes can perceive certain wavelengths of light just as plants can absorb different wavelengths of light. Plants do this using photopigments, which can absorb certain wavelengths of light. Absorption is just one fate for photons that encounter a solid surface. Alternatively, the photons might be reflected or transmitted. Chlorophyll appears green because it is not absorbed. When visible light from the sun gets through our atmosphere, it appears to us as white light, which has photons of all visible wavelengths in it. The light hits the chloroplasts in the leaves, which absorb photons of light, and you get this Pink Floyd Dark Side of the Moon effect. What this illustration is showing us is that white light hitting a leaf will not absorb green wavelengths, only reflect and transmit them. Another demonstration is in order. Imagine, if you will, an archer with a bow and arrow. The archer has three targets. She shoots her first arrow and thwip, hits the target. The arrow is stuck in the target, which is to say that the target has absorbed the arrow. Arrow number 2 is knocked and the bowstring drawn. She releases arrow number 2 and thwip. The arrow goes straight through the target and out the back of the target. Target number 2 has transmitted the arrow. Target number 3 awaits. Another arrow is drawn from the quiver and knocked. The archer takes careful aim and, much to her surprise, the third arrow hits the target but bounces off of it. The third arrow has been reflected off of the target. Now, instead of arrows, let's call them photons. And instead of targets, let's call them chloroplasts. The targets are all made of the same stuff. It's the arrows that are different. Arrow number 1 might have been a red or blue photon, but arrows 2 and 3 in this analogy are green. For effective photosynthesis, photons are absorbed. Which photons? Different pigments absorb different wavelengths of light. This graph shows the absorption spectra of 3 different plant photopigments: chlorophyll A, chlorophyll B, and some of the carotenoids. The traces for each of them show the respective color that they reflect. Blue-green for chlorophyll A, kind of olive-green for chlorophyll B, and orange. If you think you know where carotenoids were first isolated, I bet you are correct, because you probably said carrots. As you can see, chlorophyll A and B both absorb very strongly in the purple and blue wavelengths, and also into the orange and red. Carotenoids absorb most of the blue, but no orange or red. This graph shows something a little different. This is called the action spectrum of photosynthesis. This trace shows which wavelengths of light are most useful for photosynthesis, at least in terms of how much oxygen is produced under the influence of these photons. Looking at these traces side by side, you can see how the absorption spectra of the different photopigments seem to work together to produce the action spectrum for photosynthesis, and that is correct. Here is the structure of a chlorophyll molecule. You don't need to memorize it, but there are some interesting features I should mention. The business end of chlorophyll is up here at the top, here in the porphyrin ring. The porphyrin ring contains an atom of magnesium. Also of note is this R group up in the upper right corner up here. In chlorophyll A, this substitution is a methyl group. In chlorophyll B, there's an aldehyde functional group. This small change in the molecule is what makes all the difference in the absorption spectra. Chlorophyll A is the most abundant in plant cells, but chlorophyll B and the carotenoids help to broaden the spectrum of light that can be used to photosynthesize. Another feature to notice is this hydrocarbon tail down here at the bottom. What do you know about hydrocarbons? The answers I'm looking for are nonpolar and or hydrophobic. Why should chlorophyll have a fatty tail on it? Well, where do we find chlorophyll? Anchored in the thylakoids, which are membranes. And those phospholipids like to hang out with nonpolar molecules. So let's explore how chlorophyll works a little more. Back in chapter 2, I mentioned how electrons orbit the nucleus. Electrons will occupy orbitals, and they can jump to higher orbitals further away from the nucleus when they absorb energy. This increases their potential energy and their instability. An electron can absorb energy, and when the electron collapses back down to the original or ground state, they release that energy. If the chlorophyll is purified from the chloroplast, it will still absorb photons of light, but with no photosystems to receive that energy, the electrons collapse and emit another photon. This will produce something known as fluorescence, as well as heat. This drawing shows what I just described. A chlorophyll molecule absorbs a photon, causing an electron to jump to a higher orbital or an excited state. The instability of this excited state cannot be sustained, and the electron will collapse back down to the ground state. But as it does, it has to release the energy. That's the first law of thermodynamics. The energy released in an isolated chlorophyll molecule, that is to say, a chlorophyll molecule not plugged into the thylakoids and part of a photosystem, will release a photon of light and some heat. The photons emitted through fluorescence are brick red, which are longer wavelength and lower energy than the photon absorbed. That has to be the case, right? Because the second law of thermodynamics says so. But chlorophyll fluorescing is not its best trick. Not by a long shot. The best trick is using those excited electrons to convert solar energy, or electromagnetic radiation, into chemical energy. To do this, chlorophyll molecules are anchored in a complex of proteins called a photosystem. In the middle of the photosystem is a reaction center complex, and that complex is surrounded by light harvesting complexes. The light harvesting complexes receive photons and transfer the energy to the reaction center. This cartoon of a photosystem will help clarify the process. As you can see, the photosystems are anchored in the membranes of the thylakoids. Photons of sunlight hit the pigment molecules and excite electrons in those pigment molecules. That state of excitement is transferred between different pigment molecules until the excited state reaches the reaction center complex. This passing of electron excitement is kind of like jumping from one trampoline to another at the jumping place with trampolines. In the reaction center complex, electrons are transferred from a special pair of chlorophyll A molecules to the primary electron acceptor, which then becomes reduced. This ribbon model of a photosystem is showing the same thing, only not so clearly as on the previous slide. The different colors in here just represent different proteins, not anything to do with photon wavelengths per se. There are actually two different types of photosystems in plants, called photosystem 2 and photosystem 1. And yes, there is a good reason that I said 2 before 1.